Welcome back to Snap Happy Beginners Photography, produced by Clairvit Productions for Hastings Digital Museum. And what we're looking at this time is how you might photograph landscapes and people. So regarding photographing landscapes, these are the things I want to look at this week. More about them later. So let's look at this idea of depth of field. This is this week's science lesson. We need to do some explanations here as to what depth of field is and how it can make a difference to your photograph. So we need to look at how cameras work. The earliest and simplest cameras were pinhole cameras. Basically, if you have a box and you were to put a screen or a piece of film or something on the back of that box, you can get an image. What you've got outside the box is the object that you're taking a photograph of, and if that object is well lit, then rays of light from that object will pass through the hole in the side of the box, and the ray of light from the top goes one way, the ray of light from the bottom goes the other way, and what you end up with is an image on the back of the box that is upside down to the image that you were taking a photograph of. So your film would be on the back of the box there. The problem with having a very small hole that comes into the camera is it doesn't let in much light. It gives you a very sharp image, but it might mean that the subject might need to stand still for a very long time, which is why in the past you'd have people standing very still to have their photograph taken. You can overcome this by making the hole bigger. That will let in more light, but the trouble is, as soon as you let in more light, you're going to get a much more blurred image. I've illustrated that on this diagram here, where, as you can see, the rays of light from different parts of the object are spread out across the back of the camera. So what you have here is you have a very small image and a very large image, and every other image in between, all superposed on top of each other, and so you get an exceptionally fuzzy image, and this is called what's being out of focus. So what you need to do to try and correct this is you'll need to use a lens, and this is where the lens comes in on the camera, and where we talk about something called depth of field. So basically, the smaller the aperture is, that's the hole that's letting the light into the camera, then the more in focus will your whole picture be. This is very good for landscapes, but it might not be what you want if you're taking, say, a portrait. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is taking two photographs, one a close-up photograph of somebody, and one a landscape. Here, so at the moment, I'm just looking at depth of field. I'm not looking at any of the other rules. This is what we're looking at. And in the landscape photograph to the right, you can see that okay, I'm focusing on the East Hill lift, but nevertheless most of that photograph is in focus. The grass in front, the sea behind, virtually everything is within focus because I've got a small aperture. On the photograph on the left, once again, you can see that most of the photograph is in focus. The person looking through the telescope and the grass at the back and the car and so on are also in focus. Now, in terms of the portrait of somebody looking through the telegraph, do you really want to draw the eye to that lamppost and that car and that road, given that your point of interest is the person looking through the photograph? So perhaps you might need to change your depth of field. So the larger the aperture, the more out of focus the picture. So you need to make sure that you focus properly on the subject, and this is better for people. So trying to illustrate this. They're exactly the same two photographs, except now taken with a completely different aperture size, with a very wide aperture. You can see that the photograph of the landscape to the right, I've attempted once again to focus on the lift, but nothing is quite as sharp within that photograph, and the grass towards the front is out of focus. The bushes and trees are not quite in focus, and we don't start to get a focus till we get to the fence, really. And even beyond that, as we start moving backwards, the horizon doesn't seem to be quite as good either. So the photograph isn't as good because on the landscape that aperture is too wide. On the left hand side, however, what I've done is I've focused on something in the foreground. We're looking at a person who is much closer to the camera than those trees were, and we can therefore focus on that person and on that telescope, and that's what draws the eye. And by having the wider aperture, it means that the grass and the lamppost and the car behind are out of focus, so they're not drawing the eye. So the eye is drawn to the in-focus person, which is the focus of our image. The weather and the time of day can make a big difference when you're photographing a landscape. Have you got a sunny day? Have you got a cloudy day? Have you got a rainy day? They can all make a big difference to what you're looking at. Also remember that the light will change as you go through the day. Do you want a harsh light from overhead? Do you want a softer light that's coming from the horizon? Which direction do you want the light to come from? These are all things that you need to consider. It could be that if you have a particular landscape that you want to photograph, you might want to go and photograph it at different times of the day, or you might even want to go and photograph it on different days in different weather conditions. So if you see something that you really think would make a fantastic landscape photograph, you need to have patience. It could take a number of days to get the shot that you're looking for. It's probably a statement of the obvious, but the question is the horizon straight? If your horizon isn't straight within a landscape photograph, and unless you are trying to do something interesting, it's just going to look wrong. I mean, yes, you can have photographs where nothing's straight. As with all of these things, these rules are meant to be broken, and by all means consider breaking the rules, but is the horizon straight is the question that we're asking. I think I've probably given it away, but looking at this photograph, what's wrong with it? Well, actually there's a lot wrong with it, but in terms of what we're talking about, what's wrong with it? I've got the path and the grass perfectly straight. I've got the top of the East Hill perfectly straight, but the horizon is going I don't know where. So yeah, the horizon is not straight. So you need to keep an eye on your horizon. Make sure you line up on the correct thing. So if you're photographing a landscape, you need to consider what is your point of focus. What is the one thing within that landscape that is going to draw your viewer's eye? If it's just bland and there's no particular variation in the landscape, that's not going to make such an interesting photograph as if there's something in that landscape that will draw the viewer's eye. This is the point of focus. So here we have a photograph of the East Hill taken from the West Hill, straight horizon, and it's okay. It certainly shows you what's what, but is there a point of focus within this photograph? The point of focus appears to be the bushes in the front. If we look over the back, you can see there are two potential points of focus. There's the beacon, which certainly is giving us a narrative, and there is the lift, which is also giving us a narrative. So what we need to do is to choose which of those two we want to make the point of focus of our photograph, and to improve the view of the landscape so that the viewer's eye has something to look at rather than just a general picture. So you pull the point of focus right in, you've still got the landscape, but now instead of just a load of trees, we're looking at the lift itself. We can see now there is a lift. We can see that that lift appears to be dropping behind that bunch of trees down to somewhere, that it's at the sea, and the way the horizon is given it a great depth, so it's given us the idea that this lift is very high. So we've got a narrative in there as well within that point of focus. Lines are always interesting. Lines point the viewer's eye to something of interest within your photograph, or something of interest within the landscape. And it's worth looking for lines within the landscape that are pointing you towards something. And if once you start looking for and finding the lines, then the thing to do is not stand still, to move your feet, to move around, to see if you can get a different perspective on those lines, to see if they can improve what you're looking at, to see if they can draw the viewer's eye to something. So here we have a classic view of the old town from the West Hill. Beautiful, idyllic looking place. Looks semi-rural with the East Hill over there, and there are a number of lines that we can see in the photograph. There's All Saints Church dominating the middle of the image. By the side of the church you have a road, Old Humphrey Avenue, coming down there, where there's definitely a line. There's a line on top of the East Hill. There are lines on the roofs pointing in different directions, and there are lines coming up the street pointing towards the church. Now if we were to move ourselves just a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, I wonder if we can get better lines. What lines are there in the landscape? What is our point of focus? And can we arrange it so that the lines in the landscape are pointing towards it? So let's just move across a bit. All I've done is just moved myself a few meters to the left from where I was photographing before, and I think that photograph has a lot more about it. I've used a slight bit of telephoto on the lens. I've zoomed in a little bit, and I can see many more lines, and those lines appear to be pointing in general towards the church. I can see a horizon line towards the top going along the bank of trees. I can see a line going across the top of the photograph from the red house. I've got a line, that line of houses again pointing towards the church, but I've now also got the other houses lined up pointing towards the church. Once you start looking at lines, it can all get a little bit obsessive. I found a number of lines on this photograph, lines going up the streets, up High Street, up All Saints Street, pointing towards that church tower, a line coming down the roofs of Old Humphrey Avenue pointing towards the tower, a line going along the top of the trees pointing towards the tower, and another line just going right the way along the top of the trees at the top of the East Hill, not pointing towards the tower. Nevertheless, the majority of lines in this photograph do draw the eye to that tower. The blue house to the left also draws the eye, and that has a number of lines also which are pointing to it, which I haven't drawn on the diagram for sake of making things more confusing, but if you look more carefully you could see that there are other lines pointing to that as well. Once you start looking for lines in the landscape, there's no end to what you might find. It's always worth looking at the foreground when you're taking a landscape photograph. As I said, the biggest mistake I ever made was taking a load of photographs of a landscape, completely forgetting that my rucksack and junk and lenses were laid around all over the floor in front of me, and there they are right in the middle of the photograph. Classic mistake. However, have a look at the foreground. Just because you're looking towards the horizon, because you're looking towards the landscape, doesn't mean that the foreground should be neglected. Fairly lovely view of Tackleway from the top of the West Hill. It's quite an interesting photograph. We've got rows of houses pointing towards us and a row of houses going across. We've got a diagonal line coming down the hill. So there's quite a lot of interest in there. But the foreground is just some bushes. It's not a bad photograph, but could it be bettered in any way? So let's just take a few steps backwards so that we have some more interest within the foreground. The foreground isn't causing now a confusion. The foreground is now creating something that the houses can be seen beyond, and it's giving you the perspective that the houses are down the valley. We've got that interesting diagonal of the hill going across there with the sea in the background. So that is putting everything in a much greater context simply by including a little bit more in the photograph and having a look at what is in the foreground. So looking at landscapes, these are the things we've looked at. The depth of field, this idea whether or not you want the foreground or the background in focus or out of focus in relation to the subject of your photograph. Making sure the horizon's straight. Having patience, waiting around for changes in the weather, it can take a while. Having a point of focus, don't just take a photograph of a blank landscape without something in it which will draw you a bit of interest. Look for those leading lines within the environment. Don't stand still, move around. It could be that just a few meters to the left or a few meters to the right you've got a much better photograph. And keep an eye on your foreground. Make sure you haven't got a load of stuff in the front there which is going to detract from the viewer. So moving on from landscapes to people. A lot of the ideas are the same, but some of the ideas are different, mainly because your point of focus is likely to be much closer to you than it is further away. So we'll be looking at these things. Just a quick talk about lenses, because not everybody has a whole set of lenses, and they can be a very expensive accessory once you start getting into photography. There are a number of different kinds of lenses that you could use for a number of different subjects. I think most people know about a telephoto, where you can zoom in and you can zoom back again. When you're taking photographs of people, we're much more interested in seeing if we can get the background out of focus. So what we need is a wide aperture. So it's worth looking for a lens that has a very wide aperture. You can get things called prime lenses, which are fixed. So they have no telephoto or zooming capability, but they have a very wide aperture. The other thing you can do to get the background out of focus is to use a telephoto lens on somebody, but from a great distance, bringing them up to a large resolution. So it's worth checking which angle you're looking at your subject with. Are you looking straight at them? Are you looking up at them? Are you looking down at them? It's worth just moving yourself around to see what might be the best shot you've got. By the way, within this set of photographs, we're not looking at poses or anything else. We're just looking at camera angles on the subject. Poses for a shot would be a completely different set of slides and probably a whole week all by itself. So here we have just a straight on portrait. The person is looking straight at the camera at the same angle, not higher or lower from one side to the other. It's okay. It could be what you're trying to achieve. If you're taking a passport photograph, it's exactly the sort of thing that you'd be looking for. They're not looking for strange artistic angles. They're looking for a photograph of the person. I need to point out here that the camera angle is what we're looking at. We're not looking at poses. We're not looking at the person posing and so on, or a completely different skill that we'd need to cover at some other time. But it's worth changing your camera angle. Here I've got exactly the same subject, it's in exactly the same place, but then now I'm laying on the floor looking up. I don't think it particularly works for this photograph, but it's something to bear in mind and something you might want to try and do. I think it might be better if I were further away from the person. I have seen photographs taken from people looking up, and it's given somebody remarkably long legs, for example, so you can sort of change perspectives. And here we have the subject standing in exactly the same position. I've moved myself, and this time I'm standing on a chair and looking down, and this gives a much more interesting perspective to the photograph. I'm not saying it's better or worse than the straight-on photograph, but it's something to consider, and it's something that just might make the photograph more interesting. It's all about the eyes. If you're photographing people, the thing you need to concentrate is their eyes. If you can concentrate on their eyes, get their eyes in focus, everything else tends to follow. Get the eyes right, everything else is right. So here we have a photograph where I've tried to deliberately not concentrate on the person's eyes. In fact, I seem to be focusing on their smile, but they're not even looking at the camera. Whereas here we're taking a portrait of the person, and we've got them looking right at the camera, and the focus is right on the eyes, and just looking at the photograph, your eye is drawn to their eyes. It gives it more interest. One of the techniques you can use for photographing people is to consider a thing called the center dominant eye, where one of the eyes is bang in the middle of the photograph. So here I've tried to illustrate to you how you might have a center dominant eye. You've got your screen, you've divided your screen mentally into four, and you've spotted the center of your photograph. Many cameras will actually have a dot or something in the center. Some mobile phones might have a dot or something, so you know where the center of your photograph is, and you make one of the eyes dominant on that center spot. So this illustrates the center dominant eye. In this case, it's the person's right eye, it's left eye as we're looking at it, and that was photographed with the eye right on the spot in the middle of the camera. So I've now divided the screen with some grid lines, and you can see how the center dominance of that eye works. Keep an eye on the background. What is behind your subject? When I was talking about landscapes, I was saying what's in front of your center of focus, and I was talking about how I've been stupid enough to leave my own rucksack in the middle of the front of the photograph. Here you're so busy concentrating on focusing on the subject that you're trying to photograph that you might not be noticing what's behind. If you remember the photograph with the telescope earlier, there were cars and lampposts and things behind, which we didn't eliminate entirely because we couldn't, but we could at least, by changing depth of field, we could put them out of focus. What is in the background of your photograph? Too often you'll see a photograph of somebody, that's a beautiful photograph of somebody sitting somewhere or something, reading a book or whatever, and then you might notice that behind them on the side of the table or something there's a pile of old books or a cup of tea or something, which detracts from the photograph. Of course, as soon as you start trying to take a photograph of the cup of tea or something in the background, I found that it was adding interest to the photograph, so I had to work really hard to try and take a bad photograph. So in the end, I just sort of went to my studio and just, instead of taking the photograph in front of the backdrop, just swiveled around a bit so you can see the old junk that's in there, the ring light and the steps that I used to go up and down, and the side of one of the other lights. But you see, okay, yeah, if you're saying this is a photograph of somebody in a studio, fine, but you know, if this was meant to be a photograph of somebody standing there having a lovely smile and a portrait, and you go, yeah, what's all that junk in the background? The idea within this photograph was to try and get a frame within a frame, and also the interesting concept of that bird sitting on the person's shoulder. I also wanted to include the Charlie Chaplin piece of graffiti because I thought that looked quite interesting. I was really not so sure about the rest of the graffiti. I thought that kind of spoiled the look of the thing. But I took it anyway as a piece of experimentation. I didn't think it worked because of the other graffiti. And then I noticed underneath Charlie Chaplin somebody had left a water bottle. Watch the background. You're photographing a person, you're not photographing a vase or an ornament or something like that. It's a person who has feelings and understandings and things of that nature, and if you just make them feel that they're just some object, you're not going to get the best photograph. You need to talk. It makes the person more comfortable. If you're having to spend a lot of time playing around with your tripod or your camera, say so. Say what you're doing. Don't just go off and be poking around with a piece of equipment for what feels like hours and not tell them why you're doing it and what you're trying to do. Tell them what you're trying to achieve. Don't be afraid to tell the person what to do. They can't see what you can see through the viewfinder. So you need to be able to communicate to get the better picture. Candids are photographs that you take when the person that you're shooting is unaware that you're taking a photograph of them. You need to be careful with candids. You don't want to be taking photographs of things that are inappropriate. You don't want somebody to come up and start remonstrating with you if they've noticed what you're getting up to. In many ways, better to take candids as somebody that you're with and that you know. So I took a walk along the seafront with my camera to pick up a few candids and was really pleased with this one. It's two people clearly having a lovely time during COVID, but enjoying each other's company, and the whole picture tells a fantastic narrative. If anybody knows who they are, I would love to send them a copy. So looking at photographing people, remember the depth of field. The depth of field is how much of the photograph is in focus. And when you're photographing a person, you probably don't want the stuff behind them to be in focus because you're focusing on the person themselves. Which lens you use can also help you with this depth of field. Don't forget the camera angle. Are you photographing them straight on, or would you get a better image going from above or from below or from the side? Don't forget to focus on their eyes. We are naturally drawn to look at people's eyes, so you need to make sure that the eyes are in focus. Where are you going to put the person's eye? Is the person's eye going to sit on one of the third lines, or are you going to have a center dominant eye? Keep an eye on the background. Make sure there's no junk and rubbish hanging around behind that you hadn't noticed. Don't forget to talk to the person and tell them what you're doing. It relaxes them and it actually gives you a better photograph. And then candids. Candids can be great fun. You can get some fantastic images, but also be careful. So there we are. Hope you found this particular week useful, looking at photographing people, looking at photographing landscapes, and that you'll be able to use some of this within your own photography. Reminding you again of the competition, a COVID summer, which will be a bit pictorial documentation of this town in this rather unusual year. You of the rules. Photographs should be taken in the Borough, Hastings and St Leonards on a mobile telephone. Photographs straight out of the camera. No photo manipulation techniques except cropping. Please send them to the Hastings Museum Facebook page with the hashtag HMAGPhotocomp by August the 3rd, and we'll judge it on August the 9th. Thank you very much and see you next week.